So this week, our readings discuss the Holocaust and the way in which the Holocaust was conveyed to the public through different publicized mediums. In specific, the article When the Facts Didn't Speak for Themselves, The Holocaust, the New York Times by Laurel Leff, speaks to how the New York Times was incompetent in how they proliferated the experience of Jews during the Second World War. The author identifies her argument by saying Americans did not reject the Holocaust, but instead were not presented with the information in a way that allowed them to grasp it at all. Laurel Leff believes that the journalists of this time bear much of the American public's ignorance during the covering of the World War II genocide. The press is very much one that sets the agenda for public issues, and furthermore can contribute to the public's memory or lack thereof in any given event. It was a question of being ineffective then, as the placement of the news concerning the Holocaust was almost exclusively written about on the inside pages, with a failure to highlight the important issues that plagued the Jewish victims. One of the most important quotes that I found was on page 53 of Laura Leff's article, and she writes, "There is an epistemological explanation. To know something requires more than the dissemination of information. The information must, in Yehuda Bauer's formulation, be believed and internalized. There are two obstacles to forming belief, what I would call routine doubts, doubts about whether the information is accurate, and then existential doubts, doubts about the meaning of information. Both types came into play in considering news accounts of the Holocaust, although they are seldom carefully distinguished." So when I read this quote, the first thing I thought was the connection between the ideas in this article concerning existential doubts and what Raphael Lemkin fought for when he insisted upon the need to name the killing atrocities taking place around the world. Lemkin fought for a naming of genocide, as it was not only a crime against the rules of war, but a crime against humanity. Before the labeling of genocide, Winston Churchill famously said that they are in the presence of a crime without a name. Thus, I found a parallel, as Laurel Leff iterates in her article, that the publishing of the European war failed to name and label the victims as Jews. She writes on page 67, "Even the stories that dealt more directly with the Holocaust did not make clear who was suffering, unlike the inside stories, which almost always clearly identified the victims as Jews." She then continues on to write in how one particular article, it never even mentioned that Jews were involved until the 13th paragraph on the inside jump. The article furthers this point by speaking to how the New York Times would write about topics that seemed to warrant the word Jew, but would not actually include them. The Times, instead, would write about refugees and Europe's uprooted people. Ultimately, we must consider what is at stake when we give a victim a name or a crime a name. It seems unconscionable when Laurel Leff writes about the Jean Caravan's first-person account of Buchenwald and how the Jewish nature of the catastrophe was censored. She describes how the victims were said to be nondescript prisoners, and that it was not until the last 6 paragraphs of a 36-paragraph story that the prisoners were called Jews. This avoidance speaks to the atrocity. The way images of political dissent and protest spill over national borders or leapfrog across entire countries to impact upon political struggles waged elsewhere around the world points once again to the transnationalizing nature of global protest communications, as well as their capacity to help build and sustain feelings of political affinity and solidarity. The New York Times, along with a variety of other publications, sustained the distance between the general public and the genocide taking place in Europe by failing to call the victims who they were and by failing to call the violence what it was. Just as Raphael Lemkin knew that the term denationalization seemed inadequate to connote biological destruction, or other terms such as Italianization or Germanization, as they were too generic, we can see how refugees does not adequately acknowledge Jewish experience. By naming it, we find power and we find justice. By not naming them, the New York Times took away their power and made it more palatable for readers across the world, and ultimately encouraged a sort of cognitive dissonance. We cannot help those who we cannot name. Undeniably, the consistent downplaying of the extermination of the Jews during the war made possible the conditions for collective amnesia after the war. Thus, the question of palatability and the atrocity of the acts is representative through both the crime not having a name and the victims remaining anonymous.